Okay, so this is a part of the talk where if you are squicked out or weirded out by a conversation about sex or pornography, feel free to leave, right? I'm not going to get grotesque, I'm not going to show any porn or anything, but we are going to talk about sex and porn. So if that weirds you out, or if you'd rather not be exposed to it, take a minute to leave. No one's going to judge you. I'll put up some funny pictures here for you, so there you go. We can have a chuckle. We can have a chuckle about this topic. Okay. So, this is the Alternative Sexualities Conference in 2017 in New York City. A couple of years ago, they put out a call for people to speak at this conference. And they said, we want people to talk about alternative sexual identities. They listed off this long list. I'm not a sex researcher. I have no interest in doing sex research. I'm a social psychologist. However, they said we need people who belong to these sexual identities. And someone mentioned furries on that list. Furries as a sexual identity. Well, hold on. At least in our understanding of it, furry's a fandom, right? That would be like saying liking video games is a sexual identity. It's a little strange. And so I submitted a talk. It might have been a bit of a joke, and I said why I should not be giving a talk about furries to the Alternative Sexualities Conference in New York City, which was accepted. This is what happens when you're a smart ass online. Someone calls your bluff eventually. So there I am, giving my talk right after the talk about sexual vampirism. So, I gave my talk. It was actually a fantastic talk. I joke a little bit about it, but it was actually a fantastic talk because I had an opportunity to talk with a bunch of sex researchers, a bunch of people, and to lay out the argument for why I don't think it's accurate to call furry a fetish for many furries. To clarify a few things, there is nothing wrong with having kinks or fetishes. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. If you're into it, power to you. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I would argue is that furry is first and foremost, for most furries, a fan community. It's something that, like with video games, like with being a Harry Potter fan, you're a fan of this first. It makes about as much sense to me as including sex in the definition of video game fans. You say, well, hold on, there's porn, right? There's Lara Croft porn out there. Therefore, we can't describe video game fans without saying some of them might have a video game fetish. That could certainly be true. That doesn't make people who like video games people with a fetish, right? You're unnecessarily including sex in the definition, right? We're fans. Anything above and beyond that is extra details that you don't need to include, right? Don't conflate being open and accepting about sex as a norm with being all about sex, right? So we can say that the furry fandom does consume more pornography than other fandoms, right? Compared to anime fans, we do find that furries do own more pornography. I'm allowed one immature joke. That's it right there. All right. We do find that about 96% of male furries and 78% of female furries look at pornography, right? Lo and behold, people look at porn, right? This is not particularly unique. I don't gasp, right? Are your minds blown yet? We do find that about 17% of male furries and 2.2% of female furries would say that the majority, almost exclusively, they only look at furry-themed porn, right? So for most people who look at porn, even then, furry isn't the only kind of porn they look at. That there would be anything wrong with that. So we asked furries, when you consume furry media, to what extent do you only look out the erotic stuff, or do you avoid actively the erotic stuff? We found a whole bunch of middle ground here, right? We found very few furries, where's my laser here? There we are. We found very few furries who said, I only look for the erotic stuff. And we found very few furries who said, I never, ever look for the erotic stuff. There's a whole lot of middle ground there. Maybe a slight preference for erotic stuff, if anything. I use the example of Terminator. Anyone watch the movie Terminator? Yeah. Awesome film. If you haven't watched it, watch it. But Terminator, a wonderful science fiction film, right? Futuristic science fiction-y. And there's a love scene in it. There's this romantic, erotic scene in it, right? You wouldn't say that a person who likes Terminator has a science fiction fetish or a robot fetish or maybe they like the scene. But what's usually happening is, hey, I like science fiction. I'm a human who likes sex. Why wouldn't I put these two things together? It's peanut butter and jelly, right? You get a lot of that in the furry fandom too. Furries just like furry content. And hey, you want to throw, an erotic scene in a furry story or draw a pinup character who's furry? all the better, right? But this isn't actively searching it out to the exclusion of anything else, right? This isn't necessarily what you would look for if calling something a fetish for most folks. In fact, when we asked, hey, is porn really the reason, like the only reason you're here, or one of the biggest reasons? If furry really were a fetish for most or all furries, you'd expect them to say, here for the porn, right? In actuality, that's probably true for 10 to 15, maybe 20% of furries at most. You could say they're predominantly here for the porn. The vast majority of furries say, well, it's there. Porn's kind of nice, but that's not what I'm here for. I'm here for the community, right? And again, when we ask furries to estimate and say, where are you on this? And then where is the average furry? What you find is the red bars here are where you are. Right? The blue bars are where furries thought the average furry was. Furries dramatically overestimate how much the average furry is actually into porn. Now to clarify, again, about 15 to 30%, depending on where you put the line, furries are predominantly here for the erotic content. But the majority of furries are not. It's there, we can acknowledge it is there, it's what you're into, but that's not what makes it furry. That's not the defining feature of the furry fandom. People have asked us, well, can you study fetishes? Can you study kinks more? I'm a little averse to it, if only because I'm starting to stray outside of my expertise. I would really prefer to have a sex researcher come in and study these things. But the last thing I'll say about it is that part of the reason I'm a little bit nervous to study these things is because furries are very open about their sexuality. Furries are remarkably comfortable with discussing it with researchers. We ask, how open and honest are you with the idea of talking to researchers about your kinks and fetishes? 6 out of 7, very open about it. When we ask the same question to anime fans or bronies, they would break down the middle. I might be open about it, I might not tell you everything though. Right, so if we find that, I'm pulling a number out, 20% of furries were into BDSM. It's not a real number, I just made it up. Well, that number means nothing without knowing what it is in the general public, without knowing what it is in other fandoms. And if furries are all going to be honest about it, and everyone else is going to be, maybe keep that under wraps, you're going to get a dramatic difference in those numbers. Not because there's an actual dramatic difference in prevalence, but there's a dramatic difference in willingness to report. So I really do like the idea of throwing this to a sex researcher to study it in the future, because this is a problem that a lot of us on the team aren't really qualified to deal with. Let's let the experts do it. And so that's sort of the last I'll say on that topic. Let's address one more stereotype about furries, one more misconception. Furries, like a lot of internet culture, are losers who live in their basements, right? They mooch off their parents and they don't accomplish anything. Is this true? Well, thank you for getting to the punchline. Let's look at the average furry. The average furry has been interested in furry for about 7 to 8 years. They got interested initially and started calling themselves a furry in their mid-teenage years, right? So a lot of furries will say that in my early to mid-teenage years, I started finding this content and realizing there's this thing called the furry fandom. Interestingly, a lot of furries waited about a year or two before they actually jumped in and went to a con or went out and hung out with furries for the first time. Sounding familiar to some folks? Yeah, some of you are recognizing this idea. Furries are a remarkably young fandom. We're actually only allowed to study adults in most of our studies, so we're missing sort of the lower tail of this. But we tend to find that if you are, like me, getting over the age of 30, you're in the minority in this fandom, I'm afraid. You're what we might call a gray muzzle. And so these furries who tend to be over the age of 30, 35, 40, the average gray muzzle calls themselves 38.6 years old. So as I get older and older, we tend to find, I feel like I have a lot more in common with gray muzzles. We've had questions in the past about ageism in the fandom, right? So do the younger furries pick on the older furries? Do the older furries pick on the younger furries? To a small extent, this happens. So in this figure, what we've looked at is furries who are 18 years old, 24 or under, 25 to 34, and 35 or older. And we asked them, would you want to hang out with and spend time with an 18-year-old furry, a 25-year-old furry, a 35-year-old furry, a 55-year-old furry? And what we find is a little bit of ageism on both ends. If you're a younger furry, you want to hang out with the 18 to 25-year-old furries, that's the blue bar here, you're a little bit less interested in hanging out with the older furries. Okay? The yellow bars, the older furries, you're kind of interested in hanging out with the older furries and a little less interested in hanging out with the younger furries. And this kind of makes sense, right? This isn't malicious, this isn't, oh, we hate you. If you're an 18-year-old, you're at a very different stage in your life than if you're a 50-year-old. Right? If you're an 18-year-old, you're talking about moving out, you're talking about your first job, you're talking about going to college. If you're 50 years old, you're talking about paying your mortgage, you're talking about the kids growing up, you're talking about shows that didn't exist when the 18-year-old furries were born, right? So you have this sort of generational divide. So I would argue that there is this discrepancy, this somewhat ageism in the fandom. I don't think it's malicious, I don't think it's ill intent, it's just you tend to congregate around people who share your interests. This is interesting. We've been asked, is the furry fandom getting older or younger? And I've argued for years the furry fandom tends to be staying around the same age. So the red bar is the average furry at Anthrocon across almost 6 to 7 years of studying it. And it's maybe crept up about a year, suggesting that furries are joining the fandom and they're getting a bit older, but there's so many new furries coming in, it keeps driving down the age. Look at the brony fandom in the same time. What you see is a fandom where a lot of people got on at the beginning, and then by the 3rd or 4th season, there weren't a lot of new bronies coming in. So you had the same group of folks getting older without a lot of new blood. This is what it looks like when a fandom gets older over time. This is what it looks like when a fandom stays relatively young, when you have a constant influx of new folks coming in and keeping it a very young fandom. So a very interesting question that we've been able to answer by looking at year-by-year data in the fandom. It seems to suggest that even though the furry fandom continues to be growing, it's a lot of younger folks coming in, keeping it this fresh and vibrant place. Now, I mentioned all of this to say that the furry fandom contains a lot of young folks. And one thing we know about a lot of young folks, especially in this economy, they're finding it hard to move out, right? A lot of folks find it really hard to move out of home. And in fact, we find that it's the furries under the age of 24, who are much more likely to be living with their parents. Most furries over the age of 24 have long since moved out with a partner, with a roommate on their own. When you look at how much the average furry makes at the age of 18, they're making less than $10,000 a year. That's really hard to live on, right? It's not until they're in their 30s that they're starting to make $30,000, $40,000 a year. That's why they're not moving out. It's not a furry issue, it's an age issue. The fandom is relatively young. Younger people tend to find it really hard to move out on their own. Right? And coupled with this, the fact that a lot of furries are also in school. About half of furries are part-time or full-time enrolled in school, in addition to trying to work part-time or full-time. Furries are kind of busy. They're keeping their schedules busy with work and with school. And we know that they're keeping their lives busy with school because when we ask furries directly about their level of education, the vast majority of furries are currently attending college, have completed some college, or some kind of bachelor's, master's, or PhD. Right? Furries do well in school. And in fact, when we ask them directly, hey, the last grades you got in school, what was your last average? And we found that furries are kind of nerdy. The average furry gets about a B+, right? So furries, I want to conclude on this point, are a bunch of nerds, right? We're not weirdos, we're not damaged people, we're not deviants, we're a bunch of nerds. And we make a lot more sense when you realize that just like Star Wars nerds, just like sports nerds, just like anime nerds, we're all nerds, and we have our interests that we're passionate in, and the fandom makes a lot more sense when you start to view it that way. So just to wrap things up here, some shameless self-promotion. That's our book, First Science. It's due for a revamp next year when it'll be the 10th edition, or sorry, 10-year anniversary of our research. You can go to firstscience.com and download it for free. So please, if you want to see these statistics or more, go there to our website. Let's see, yeah, furryresearch.org. You can also go there if you're really numbers focused. Firstscience.com. If you want to email me, that's my email address. You can email me directly and ask me questions. Yeah, and again, thank you to the Canadian government for helping sponsor this. Thank you very much to our research assistants, some of which are here, and we'll be passing around surveys to anyone who raises their hand in order to help participate in our research if you'd like. And thank you to all the furries over the years who've helped us make this project possible, because without you, we really couldn't study the fandom the way we have and get all of this rich data to answer these kinds of questions.